the last week of October, 1878, along the wind-scoured flats of the Sandhill Fork settlement in western Nebraska Territory, while every reasonable homesteader within 30 miles was doing the ordinary work of preparing for winter, hauling firewood by the wagon-load banking sod against the north walls of their cabins, and laying in dried buffalo dung for the stove, Silas Marden was doing something else entirely. He was doing none of those things first. Day after day, in the freezing morning wind, he stood barefoot in a shallow pit he had dug beside a slow creek bend, stomping wet clay and long prairie straw together with slow, deliberate steps, mixing the heavy mess with his feet the way old country bakers once kneaded dough. Beside him sat wooden forms he had built by hand, long rectangular molds nailed from milled pine, waiting to be packed full of his strange gray mixture. Some passing riders slowed just to watch. A few laughed openly. Others said nothing at all, but their silence carried its own judgment. The neighbors had already whispered the same word for weeks. Foolish. Silas Marden was building the walls of a new addition onto his family's cabin, not from split logs, not from sod bricks, not from milled plank, but from packed mud and prairie straw pressed thick between wooden forms, then left to harden in the cold October air. Inside the small original cabin were his wife, Adaline, 7 months heavy with their second child, and their young son, Jonah, barely 5 years old, who watched his father from the doorway with quiet, curious eyes. Every morning, Silas walked back to that clay pit before sunrise. Every evening, he returned to the cabin with his arms coated to the elbows in dried mud, his boots caked so heavily they weighed twice what they should. Nothing about the work looked normal for that country. The walls he was raising were nearly 2 feet thick, far thicker than any homesteader's cabin along the fork, and the surfaces looked rough, uneven, almost primitive. Travelers coming down the trail from Ogallala shook their heads and muttered that the young man had lost whatever sense he'd arrived with. To them, it did not look like a home. It looked like a mud cave rising from the prairie. And in that country in that season, mud meant one thing. It meant a man who did not understand what a Nebraska winter could do to soft materials. What secret did those strange, thick walls hold? Would Silas Marden's stubborn gamble shelter his growing family, or would the coming blizzard collapse the whole thing around them? Subscribe now to witness the strange truth that turned an entire settlement's mockery into silence. One raw afternoon, a rider on a lean gray mare crested the ridge above the Marden claim and reined in hard. His name was Colonel Roderick Vance, though the war had ended more than a decade earlier, and everyone in the settlement still called him by that title. He had homesteaded along the fork for 11 winters. He had buried 2 children beneath the frozen ground of that country, one from fever, one from cold, and he was not a man given to gentle words with new settlers. Vance stared down at Silas for a long moment without dismounting. Then he shook his head slowly. "Son," he called across the wind, "you can pack that dirt from now until Christmas. First hard freeze rolls through here, that wall's going to crack from the ground to the eaves." Silas kept mixing. He had learned early not to argue with men like Vance, not because he lacked words, but because he had learned that words spent on skeptics were words wasted. Vance eased his horse a few steps closer, his gaze sweeping over the wooden forms, the drying blocks stacked against the south wall, the small pit of gray mud, and the thin figure of a 5-year-old boy carrying a wooden bucket almost half his own weight. The colonel's jaw tightened. "You've got a woman inside that cabin," he said, quieter now, "carrying a child, and you're building her a house out of mud like some Mexican adobe." He paused, letting the word hang in the cold air like an accusation. "This ain't Sonora, Marden, this is Nebraska." Silas finally straightened, pressing one muddy palm against the small of his back. Cold wind moved through his damp shirt, but he did not shiver. He had passed through shivering hours earlier. "I know where I am, Colonel," he said quietly. Vance studied him for another long moment. Then his eyes drifted toward the cabin doorway, where Adaline had appeared with a wool shawl pulled tight around her swollen belly. She met the colonel's gaze without flinching, though her hands trembled slightly at the edge of the shawl. Vance touched the brim of his hat toward her, not out of warmth, but out of the old habit of a man who had once known better manners. Then he looked back down at Sila's. Mud freezes, son. Freezes and cracks. And when the January wind comes down through this fork, it'll find every one of those cracks like a knife finds a seam. He clicked his tongue once, and the gray mare turned. I'll be praying for that boy of yours, he said over his shoulder as he rode away. Somebody ought to. The wind carried his voice a long way across the flats before the silence swallowed it. Adaline stayed in the doorway for a long time after Vance disappeared over the ridge. She said nothing. She did not need to. Silas already knew every question moving behind her tired eyes. That night, after Jonah had been tucked beneath the heavy quilts near the stove, Adaline sat across from her husband at the small pine table, a tin cup of chicory coffee warming her palms. The lantern flickered low between them, and for a while only the sound of prairie wind pressing against the shutters filled the room. Silas, she finally said, the Colonel has seen more winters here than we have years married. Silas turned a small piece of dried mud between his fingers. He had carried it in from the newest block that afternoon, and he had been studying it ever since, feeling its weight, testing its edges with his thumbnail. He has, Silas agreed, and he's watched half the cabins along this fork lose their heat by February. Sod caves in. Log chinking dries out and falls loose. Plank walls whistle like a fife by January. He set the piece of mud gently on the table between them as though offering evidence in a courtroom. This, he said, does not whistle, this does not shrink, this does not let go of its heat once it warms. Adaline looked at the small gray fragment. It did not look impressive. It looked like something a child might pull from a creek bank and forget by nightfall. Where did you learn it? She asked softly. Silas was quiet for a moment. His eyes drifted toward the darkened window, past the flickering lantern light, past the shape of Jonah sleeping curled beneath the quilts. Then he told her about the winter he had spent along the Rio Grande, 7 years before he ever met her, when he had ridden with a survey crew mapping trade routes through the borderlands of New Mexico. He had slept many nights in adobe villages then, small clusters of thick-walled homes built by families who had lived in that country for 200 years. He remembered how the desert cold could kill a man in the open at night, how the wind came down out of the mountains hard enough to knock a horse sideways. And yet inside those adobe walls the air stayed still and warm long after every fire had burned to coals. I asked an old woman there once, Silas said, how her walls held the heat so long. She told me the walls were slow, slow to warm, slow to lose it, slow to answer the weather. He picked up the small piece of dried mud again. She said the wind cannot argue with something that does not move. Adaline sat very still. She did not know what to say to that. She had grown up in Ohio, where houses were made of wood and stone, where winter came softer and shorter, and where no one ever spoke of walls as though they were living things. She looked toward the window again, toward the black prairie beyond it, and toward the vast, invisible country stretching hundreds of miles north where the true blizzards were born. But Silas, she said finally, her voice barely above the sound of the lantern flame, New Mexico is not Nebraska. The cold there is not the cold here. Silas nodded slowly. He had expected the question. He had asked it of himself 1,000 times already, standing knee-deep in that clay pit through freezing October mornings. You're right, he said. It isn't the same cold, which is why I'm building the walls twice as thick as any adobe I ever saw down south, 22 inches through from the outer face to the inner, and I'm mixing the straw longer, packing it denser. He paused. The old woman told me something else, too. She said thin walls are for gentle countries, thick walls are for cruel ones. Adaline lowered her eyes to the tin cup in her hands. She did not answer right away. Somewhere outside, a coyote called across the flats, a long, thin sound that carried farther than it should have. She thought of Jonah asleep beneath the quilts. She thought of the child moving inside her. She thought of the Colonel's parting words riding away on the wind. Somebody ought to pray for that boy. I trust you, she said finally, and she meant it. But even as she said the words, both of them understood that trust was not the same thing as certainty. Over the following days, Silas returned to the clay pit before every sunrise. The temperature was dropping faster now. The creek water grew a thin skin of ice each night that had to be broken with a heavy stick before he could scoop the wet clay onto his mixing tarp. His hands cracked open along the knuckles from the cold and the constant wet. Adaline pressed bare grease into the splits each evening and wrapped his fingers in strips of clean muslin. He never complained. He simply woke earlier the next morning and returned to the pit. Jonah began helping in small ways. The boy carried short lengths of straw from the drying rack to the mixing pit, his small arms wrapped around bundles nearly half his size. He learned to test the mud with his bare hand, pressing his palm flat against the mixture and watching how deeply his fingers sank. Too wet meant more straw. Too dry meant more water from the creek. His father praised him quietly when he got it right, and Jonah began to walk taller through the frozen prairie grass, proud of a job he did not yet fully understand. One afternoon, while Silas was packing a fresh block into a wooden form, Jonah looked up at him with a serious expression far older than his 5 years. "Papa," he asked, "will the mud walls really keep us warm?" Silas pressed the last handful of clay and straw mixture down into the corner of the form and smoothed it flat with the heel of his hand. He did not answer right away. Then he wiped his palms on a rag and crouched down until his eyes were level with his son's. "Jonah," he said quietly, "the walls do not keep the cold out. Nothing keeps the cold out. Not sod, not log, not stone." He touched the boy's chest gently, right above his small, quick heartbeat. "The walls only slow the cold down. They make the cold work harder to reach us. And while the cold is working, the fire inside stays ahead of it." Jonah frowned, thinking hard. "Like a race?" he asked. Silas smiled for the first time in many days. "Yes," he said, "exactly like a race." That evening, an old freighter named Josiah Bellamy passed through the Sandhill Fork on his way south toward Ogallala, hauling a wagon load of tanned buffalo hides. He stopped at the Marden Claim to water his mules and share a cup of coffee. Bellamy had traveled the plains for more than 30 years. He had wintered in Montana Territory, Wyoming Territory, and the Dakotas. He had once spent a January snowed-in with a Lakota family along the Niobrara, and he had learned more about surviving cold from that winter than from any settlement he had ever passed through. Bellamy did not laugh when he saw the mud walls. He did not shake his head or offer warnings. He walked slowly around the half-finished addition, ran one bare hand along the rough gray surface, and knocked twice against the thickest block with his knuckle. The sound came back low and dull, more like a stone struck through wool than like a plank of dry pine. Bellamy grunted once. He walked another slow circle around the addition, stopping now and then to press his palm against different sections of the wall. He tested the corners. He tested the joints where the new mud met the old log cabin. He knelt down and studied the base course, where Silas had built up a low stone footing to keep the mud clear of ground moisture. Then he rose, brushed the dust from his knees, and looked at Silas with something very close to respect. "You built these on stone," he said. "It was not a question." "I did," Silas answered. "8 courses of creek rock laid dry, then capped with flat slate before I set the first mud block." Bellamy nodded slowly. "Good. Mud drinks water like a horse in July. Set it on dirt, it'll wick up moisture from the ground all winter and split apart come thaw." He glanced toward the addition again. "You knew that?" Silas did not answer. He had not known exactly. He had guessed. He had watched the way rain pooled around the old cabin's log foundation the previous spring, and he had reasoned that mud walls would suffer worse in the same conditions. So he had spent 3 weeks that summer hauling creek stones one wagon load at a time and laying them into a shallow trench beneath the future walls. It had cost him half his planting season. Bellamy studied him for another long moment. Then he said, quietly, "The Lakota families I wintered with along the Niobrara built earth lodges. Not the same as this, but not far from it. Thick walls of packed sod and clay over a wooden frame. I saw children run barefoot inside those lodges in January while the wind outside would peel skin off a man in 10 minutes. The old ones told me the earth remembers heat. Once you warm it, It holds that warmth the way a stone holds sunlight after the sun has gone down. He looked toward the small original cabin, where Adaline stood in the doorway with Jonah half hidden behind her skirts. "You've got the right idea, Martin," Bellamy said. "But right ideas are not always enough on this country." He touched the brim of his hat toward Adaline, gathered his mules, and started back toward the trail. Before he climbed onto the wagon seat, he paused and looked back. "One more thing," he called. Silas turned. "Get your roof ready," Bellamy said. "Thickest walls in the world won't matter if the wind lifts your roof come January. That's how most cabins on the plains fail. Not the walls, the roof." Then he was gone, the wagon creaking away southward through the dry prairie grass. That night Silas sat by the lantern for a long time, sketching lines onto the back of an old flour sack with a piece of charcoal. Adaline watched him from her chair beside the stove, her hands resting on the heavy curve of her belly. She did not interrupt. She had learned in the months since they had settled the claim that when Silas was working out a problem on paper, silence was more useful than questions. Finally, he set the charcoal down. "The roof has to change," he said. Adaline tilted her head. "How?" Silas turned the flour sack toward her. He had drawn a rough side view of the cabin with the new addition attached. The old roof, a simple pitched frame of sawn timbers covered in shakes, sat unchanged over the original cabin, but over the new mud-walled section he had sketched something entirely different. A low, gently sloped roof, thicker than the old one, layered with what appeared to be several distinct materials stacked together. "Sod on top," he said, pointing. "Two full courses laid grass side down over a bed of straw thatch. Under that, a layer of prairie clay mixed with more straw, packed flat over milled planks. Under the planks, a false ceiling of split cedar, air-gapped from the clay layer above it." Adaline studied the drawing. "That is a very heavy roof, Silas." "It is," he agreed. "That is the point. The wind cannot lift what it cannot budge." She looked at him then, really looked at him, the way a wife looks at a husband when she is trying to see past the man she loves and into the man she does not always understand. "Silas," she said quietly, "where did all this come from? The mud, the stone footing, the roof. Did you plan all of this before we left Ohio?" He hesitated. Then he shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "I planned the mud walls. The stone footing came from watching last spring's thaw. The roof design came tonight, sitting here with Bellamy's words in my ear. Adaline, I am not building this house from a plan. I am building it from every mistake I have ever seen other men make." He looked down at the charcoal-stained flour sack. "And from every good thing I have ever seen a wiser man do." Adaline reached across the small table and covered his cracked hand with her own. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Over the next 2 weeks, Silas worked longer hours than he had worked in his life. He rose before the false dawn and returned to the cabin long after Jonah had fallen asleep. He hauled fresh clay from a second pit he opened farther upstream, where the material was denser and held more grit. He sawed the milled planks for the roof by hand, cutting each one to length and treating the underside with a coat of pine tar boiled thin in an iron pot over an open fire. Adaline helped where she could. She could not lift the heavy blocks, not in her condition, but she could tend the boiling tar. She could sharpen the saw blades on a whetstone beside the stove. She could rock Jonah to sleep at night while Silas worked by lantern light on the roof frame. By the middle of November, the addition was fully walled. 22 inches of packed mud and prairie straw stood between the interior of the new room and the wind coming down off the northern plains. The surfaces had been finished with a thin outer coat of clay mixed with fresh ashes, a trick Silas had learned in New Mexico, which hardened into a pale gray shell tougher than the underlying mud. Inside, he had smoothed each wall by hand until the surfaces felt almost soft, like the inside of a river stone worn round by years of water. The new roof rose slowly through the second half of November. Silas raised the ridge beam alone, using a rope and pulley rig he had built from a single wagon wheel and a length of hemp rope. Adaline watched from the doorway with her heart in her throat as he balanced along the top of the wall, 13 feet above the frozen ground, guiding the heavy beam into place with a wooden mallet. When the beam finally settled into its notched saddles, Jonah cheered from the porch, and Silas allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, to sit down on the ridge and simply look out across the country he was trying so hard to survive. The northern horizon was the color of old lead. The wind moved constantly now, never truly stopping, only pausing between gusts to gather strength for the next one. Silas knew what that meant. He had watched the same sky along the Rio Grande before dust storms had swept through the survey camp and buried tents halfway up their poles. But this was a different country and a different sky. The storms that came out of the north were made of ice, not sand. And ice, he had learned, did not simply bury, it killed. Colonel Roderick Vance rode past the claim 2 days after the ridge beam went up. He did not stop this time. He only slowed his gray mare on the ridge above and stared down at the strange, thick-walled structure taking shape beside the old log cabin. His expression was harder to read now. Not amusement, not pity. Something quieter. Something almost like curiosity, though Vance would never have admitted such a thing aloud. Silas watched him from the roof. Neither man spoke. Then Vance touched the brim of his hat, turned his horse, and rode on. The gesture was small, almost nothing, but Silas felt it settle into his chest like a coin dropped into a deep well. By the first week of December, the roof was finished. Silas had laid the split cedar false ceiling first, leaving a 2-inch air gap above it, then packed nearly 6 inches of straw and clay mixture over the milled planks that rested on the roof frame. Above that, he had thatched a bed of long prairie straw laid tight and even. Above the thatch, he had cut and laid 2 full courses of prairie sod, grass side down, each block soaked in creek water before being pressed firmly into place. The finished roof weighed more than 3 tons. When the last sod block was set, Silas climbed down from the ladder, walked 20 paces out into the frozen grass, and turned to look at what he had built. The cabin no longer looked like a cabin. From the outside, the addition rose from the prairie like a low gray hill, thick-shouldered and heavy, its pale walls catching the weak December sunlight in soft, uneven patches. The old log cabin stood beside it, small and plain by comparison, connected to the new structure by a short covered walkway of split timber Silas had built to shelter the passage from wind and snow. Adaline came out to stand beside him, Jonah bundled in a wool coat between them. For a long moment none of them spoke. Then Adaline said quietly, "It looks like it grew here, Silas, like it came up out of the ground itself." Silas did not answer. He was looking north. The sky above the far horizon had turned the color of wet slate, and the wind had begun to move in a way he recognized from the survey years. Not the quick, sharp gusts of an ordinary cold front. The slow, gathering pull of something much larger drawing breath somewhere hundreds of miles away. That night Silas checked the stove 3 times before he went to bed. He inspected the chimney seal where the pipe passed through the new roof. He walked the perimeter of both cabins with a lantern, running his hand along every joint between the old log walls and the new mud walls, feeling for gaps, for cold air, for anything that did not feel right. He found nothing. Still, he did not sleep well. The storm arrived on the 4th night of December. It did not begin with wind. It began with silence. Silas woke a little after midnight to a stillness so complete that at first he thought his ears had failed him. The prairie wind, which had moved constantly outside the cabin walls for weeks, had simply stopped. He sat up in bed, listening. Adaline stirred beside him, one hand moving instinctively to the curve of her belly. "What is it?" she whispered. "Wind's gone," Silas said quietly. He rose, pulled on his coat and boots, and stepped outside into the still, black air. The stars overhead were sharp and hard, the way they only ever looked before the worst weather. He stood in the yard for a long time, breathing slowly, feeling the cold settle onto his skin like a second garment. Then far to the north he heard it. A low, distant rumble, deeper than thunder, moving through the ground as much as through the air. He had heard that sound only once before, in the mountains of New Mexico, the night before an avalanche had swept a survey camp 2 miles down a canyon. He turned and went back inside. He did not wake Adaline. He built up the stove instead, laying in the largest logs from the woodpile and adjusting the damper to burn slow and hot through the coming hours. Then he sat by the lantern with his hands folded and waited. The wind came just before dawn. It arrived as a single deep blow, not the rising cry of an ordinary storm, but a sudden, enormous pressure that pressed against every wall of the cabin at once, as though the whole northern sky had leaned down upon the earth. The old log cabin groaned. The new mud walls did not. Jonah cried out from his bed near the stove, and Adaline pulled him against her, while the wind outside built itself into a scream that Silas had heard only in nightmares since the survey years. Snow began to fall almost horizontally, so fine and hard-driven that it hissed against the outer walls like blowing sand. Silas moved through the cabin with quiet, careful steps, checking the shutters, feeding the stove, watching the chimney draft. The old cabin creaked and shifted around him. Cold air pushed steadily through the log chinking where the mud daub had dried and shrunk during autumn. He could feel the difference already in the two rooms. In the old cabin, the temperature dropped noticeably within the first hour of the storm, and Silas had to bank the stove hotter than he had planned. In the new addition, the temperature barely moved. He walked slowly from one room to the other, holding his hand near the walls. The mud walls felt cool to the touch, but not cold. The log walls of the old cabin felt actively cold, as though the wind itself had reached through the wood and pressed its fingers against the interior. Adaline noticed it too. She carried Jonah into the new room and settled him onto a pallet of quilts along the interior wall. "The air feels different in here," she said softly. "It feels still, like the storm is far away." Silas nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. He had spent months building for this moment, and now that the moment had arrived, he found himself listening to every sound the walls made, waiting for the first crack, the first split, the first sign that Colonel Vance had been right after all. But the walls made almost no sound at all. The wind battered against them, threw hard-driven snow against them, pressed against them with the full weight of the northern plains, and the mud walls simply stood. They did not creak. They did not groan. They did not answer the storm at all. The old cabin groaned constantly, a low, continuous protest of wood under stress, but the new addition remained silent. Silas walked to the corner where the new mud walls joined the old log walls and pressed his ear against the seam. He could hear the wind hissing softly through the log joints, but when he pressed his ear against the mud wall itself, only inches away, he heard nothing. It was as though the storm existed on one side of a boundary and did not exist on the other. By mid-morning, the light outside had failed almost completely. The world beyond the shutters was a shifting gray-white void with no horizon, no sky, no ground. Silas cracked the door only once briefly to check the drift line forming against the north wall. Snow was piling fast, already halfway up the outer face of the mud wall on the windward side. But the drift was piling smoothly against the thick, immovable structure, not spilling around it or creating the strange rebound currents he had seen sometimes near thinner walls. The mud absorbed the storm the way a boulder absorbs a river, not resisting, simply refusing to move. He shut the door and barred it. Adaline was heating a pot of thin stew over the stove, one hand resting on her belly. Jonah sat on the pallet in the new room, watching his father with wide, quiet eyes. "Papa," the boy asked, "is the storm winning?" Silas crouched down beside him and pulled the quilt higher around his small shoulders. "The storm is not winning, Jonah." He glanced at the pale gray wall behind his son's head. "The storm does not know we are here." The blizzard lasted 3 full days. On the first day, the wind was the enemy. On the second day, the cold became the enemy. The temperature outside dropped so far that Silas stopped trying to guess it. Water left in a tin cup near the door froze solid within an hour. Frost began forming along the interior surface of the old log walls, thick white patterns that grew steadily throughout the day. In the new addition, the mud walls remained clear. Not warm exactly, but dry, untouched by frost. The stove in the new room burned the same amount of wood as it had the day before the storm began, and the air inside the addition stayed comfortable enough that Adaline was able to remove her wool shawl for hours at a time. By the second evening, they had moved almost entirely into the new room. The old cabin had become a cold storage space, useful for keeping the water bucket from spoiling, but no longer fit for sleeping. Silas kept the stove in the new room burning steadily, but he no longer needed to feed it as often as he had feared. The thick mud walls were doing exactly what the old woman in New Mexico had described so many years before. They were slow, slow to warm, slow to lose the warmth once it had settled into them. By the second night, Silas could press his bare hand against the interior surface of the mud wall closest to the stove and feel a gentle, patient heat radiating back into the room, like the warmth of a stone that had spent a long afternoon in the sun. The walls themselves had become a second stove, storing heat during the burning hours and releasing it slowly through the long, cold night. On the third day, Adaline began having sharp pains. Silas noticed them first from the way she paused in the middle of stirring the stew, one hand gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles went pale. She did not cry out. She had never been a woman who cried out, but her breath caught and her eyes closed for a long moment before she opened them again and continued stirring. "Adaline," Silas said quietly. She shook her head. "Not now, not real ones, just false. The baby is not due until January." Silas set down the log he had been about to add to the stove. He crossed the room and gently took the wooden spoon from her hand. "Sit," he said. "I will finish the stew." She did not argue. She sat on the edge of the pallet, one hand on her belly, and watched the flame flicker in the stove. Outside, the wind still screamed. The storm had shifted direction sometime during the previous night, coming now more from the northwest than the north, and the new angle was pressing hard against the western wall of the addition. But the wall did not answer. Silas listened to it as he stirred the stew, waiting for the first sound of stress, the first hollow crack that would mean the storm had finally found a weakness. He heard nothing. Only the deep, muffled roar of the blizzard beyond 22 inches of packed earth. Jonah had fallen asleep beside his mother, his small hand curled into the hem of her dress. The lantern light moved softly across the pale gray wall behind them. For a long moment, Silas simply stood there, holding the wooden spoon, watching his family in the warm, still air of the room he had built with his own hands. Then Adaline drew a sharp breath. This one was different. Silas saw it in her face before she spoke. She looked up at him and her eyes were wide but calm. "Silas," she said quietly, "the baby is coming." Silas did not move for a full second. Then he set the spoon down. He crossed the room and knelt beside her, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You said January." She shook her head slowly. "The storm has moved her, or she has decided. Either way, she is coming." Outside, the blizzard howled. There would be no doctor. There would be no midwife. The nearest woman with any experience was Ruth Kellenberg, who lived 4 miles north across country that had ceased to exist. There was only Silas and Adaline and Jonah asleep on the pallet, and the thick warm walls of the room he had built for exactly this kind of moment without ever knowing it. Silas took his wife's hand. "Then we will do this together," he said, "the way we have done everything else." The next hours were the longest of his life. He boiled water on the stove. He tore clean muslin into strips. He held Adaline's hand when the pains came hard, and he wiped her forehead with a cool cloth between them. He murmured quiet things to her that he could not remember afterward. Jonah woke once during the night, saw what was happening, and simply rolled toward the wall without a word, the way a child who has grown up on the frontier already understands too much. The stove burned low, then high, then low again. Silas fed it without thinking. The mud walls held their patient warmth. Just before dawn on the third morning of the storm, Adaline gave birth to a daughter. The child came into the world small and red and furious, her thin cry rising through the warm, still air of the room like a small, bright flame lit inside a great dark house. Silas caught her in his own hands. He wrapped her in a strip of clean muslin and laid her against Adaline's chest, and for a long moment none of them made a sound. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, though Silas knew that was only the trick a man's ears played on him in a moment like that. Adaline was crying quietly. Silas realized distantly that he was crying too. Jonah crept across the floor on his hands and knees and stared down at his tiny sister with the solemn wonder of a boy who understood that something enormous had just happened in the small, warm room where he had spent 3 days of storm. "Papa," Jonah whispered, "what is her name?" Silas looked at Adaline. Adaline looked down at the small red face pressed against her collarbone, and she smiled through her tears. "Wren," she said softly. "Her name is Wren." Silas nodded. Outside, the storm went on. But inside the mud-walled room, the world had grown quiet enough that a father could hear his newborn daughter breathing. The blizzard broke a little after midday. It did not fade slowly, the way ordinary storms did. It simply stopped. The wind that had roared for 3 days and 3 nights fell silent between one heartbeat and the next, and the sudden stillness after so much sound was almost more shocking than the storm itself had been. Silas stood by the door for a long time before he opened it. When he finally pulled the door inward, he had to push against a shoulder-high wall of packed snow that had settled against the covered walkway between the two cabins. He dug his way out with a wooden shovel he had leaned against the wall for exactly this purpose. When he finally stepped outside into the light, he stopped. The Sandhill Fork was gone. Every landmark he had known, the low creek bed to the south, the ridge line to the west, the sod fence he had built around the vegetable garden, had disappeared beneath a smooth white ocean of drifted snow. The world had become featureless, blinding, silent. Only the two cabins remained, and even they had changed. The old log cabin was buried nearly to the eaves along its north wall. The new mud-walled addition, however, rose out of the drift like a low gray hill, its thick walls still standing straight and unmarked, its heavy sod roof holding a smooth crown of fresh snow that had not blown off during the storm because there had been nothing thin enough on the surface for the wind to lift. Silas walked slowly around the new addition, one hand trailing along the pale gray wall. He was looking for cracks. He was looking for splits. He was looking for any of the failures that Colonel Vance had promised him back in October. He found none. The mud walls stood exactly as he had built them. The stone footing was buried under snow but undisturbed. The sod roof had held every ounce of its own weight and the weight of a 3-day blizzard on top of it. Silas stood in the deep silence of the buried prairie and felt, for the first time since October, that he could take a full breath. 2 days later, Colonel Roderick Vance appeared on the ridge above the claim. He was riding a different horse this time, a heavier bay he had borrowed from a neighbor, because the gray mare had died in the night sometime during the 2nd day of the storm, frozen standing up in a stall that had lost its roof to the wind. Vance had lost the mare, half his chickens, and nearly the tip of his own left ear to frostbite during a desperate attempt to reach his barn on the 2nd morning of the blizzard. He rode down the slope slowly, staring at the two cabins. When he reined in beside the mud-walled addition, he did not dismount at first. He simply sat there and looked. Silas came out to meet him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Vance's eyes moved slowly across the pale gray walls, across the heavy sod roof, across the smooth, unbroken snowdrift that had piled around the addition instead of over it. Then he finally swung down from the borrowed bay, his boots crunching into the deep snow. He walked to the nearest wall and pressed his gloved hand flat against it. He held it there for a long time. Then he pulled off the glove and pressed his bare hand against the mud. Silas watched him quietly. Vance closed his eyes. Silas understood in that moment what the older man was feeling. The wall was cool to the touch but not cold. It held no frost. It held no ice. It simply stood there, patient and unmoving, the way a stone in a riverbed holds its place while the current tries to sweep it away. Vance finally opened his eyes and looked at Silas. His face had aged years in 3 days. "Marden," he said quietly, "I buried a boy in this country 9 winters ago, 6 years old. He got cold in his sleep during a January storm because my cabin walls could not hold the heat the stove was giving them. I have thought about those walls every winter since." He paused. "I never once thought about mud." Silas did not answer. There was nothing to say. Vance looked toward the doorway of the addition where Adaline had appeared with a bundle in her arms. "That is a new baby," Vance said. "Yes," Silas said, "born during the storm." Vance looked at the bundle for a long moment. Then he looked back at the mud walls, and then slowly he took off his hat. He did not say the words. He did not need to. Silas understood. Over the following weeks, other men from the Sandhill Fork settlement came to see the strange, thick-walled addition that had held against the December blizzard. Some came quietly, as Vance had come. Others came with more questions than the colonel had asked. Silas walked each of them through the addition the same way. He showed them the stone footing beneath the walls. He showed them the mixture of clay and prairie straw. He showed them the layered roof with its air-gapped cedar ceiling and its heavy sod cap. He did not lecture. He did not boast. He only answered what was asked, and when the men had seen enough, he let them ride home to think about what they had seen. By the following autumn, 3 other homesteaders along the Sandhill Fork had begun packing mud walls onto their own cabins. Josiah Bellamy, the old freighter, passed through again that spring and spent a full day sitting with Silas beside the creek, talking quietly about earth lodges and adobe villages, and the long, slow wisdom of walls that did not fight the weather but instead outlasted it. The Marden claim stood along the Sandhill Fork for more than 50 years. The mud walls of the addition never cracked. The sod roof was replaced twice over the decades, but the walls themselves needed only a fresh outer coat of clay and ashes every few years to keep them smooth and dry. Wren Marden grew up beneath those walls, and later gave birth to her own children beneath them. Jonah Marden grew into a tall, quiet man who homesteaded his own claim 2 miles north of his father's, and the walls of his cabin were also packed mud and prairie straw laid on a stone footing. The blizzards kept coming to that country. They came every winter, some worse than the storm of 1878, some milder. But around the Marden homestead, the walls always held and the heat always stayed, and the children always slept warm. Silas Marden never wrote down what he had learned. He never gave speeches about it. He simply built one careful thing with his own hands and let that thing speak for itself across the decades. In the end, that was enough. Do you think Silas Marden was truly ahead of his time, or was he simply one of the rare men willing to build for the country he lived in instead of the country he had come from? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of frontier grit and quiet wisdom that outlasted the storms of their age.